Okay. So, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Lila LaHood, publisher of the San Francisco Public Press. Thank you for joining us for today's Public Press Live event, Surviving the Pandemic, the Future of Local Media. I'm going to hand things off to our host, Gina Baleria, Assistant Professor of Communications and Media Studies at Sonoma State University and host of the new podcast, News in Context, which also airs on KSFP. And I am going to let Gina take it from here. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Lila. My name is Gina Baleria, and I am guest hosting this edition of Civic. I'm also the host and producer of News in Context, which airs every Friday on KSFP at 8:30 a.m. and 6:30 p.m. and is available anytime at newsincontext.net or on your favorite podcast channel. Today, we are talking about the future of local media and media challenges facing community journalism before, during, and after the pandemic. My guests today are Martin Reynolds, co-executive director of the Maynard Institute and director of the Reveal Investigative Fellowships from the Center for Investigative Reporting, and Michael Stoll, executive director of the San Francisco Public Press. Welcome to you both. I'm really excited to talk with you today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So let's start with the state of the news media industry and local news leading up to COVID-19, because though COVID-19 is exacerbating some issues and really hitting hard, it's not as if things were fine before this hit. So, I'd like to talk to you both a little bit about what's been going on in recent years that's been detrimental to new local journalism. Martin, I'd love to start with you.
Sure. Well, I'm really glad to be here, and thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this really important issue. You know, what's been happening in local news has really been a troubling hollowing out of capacity. The newspaper that you see behind me that I used to have the pleasure of editing is no more, it's a complete shell of itself, even though it has some very good journalists still working there. They won a Pulitzer for the coverage of the ghost ship fire, and then subsequently had a bunch of layoffs right after that. So it has nothing to do with the quality of people there. It has to do with ownership, owned by a hedge fund, which is, and the years and years of cutting capacity to remain profitable, rather than thinking more innovatively about how to approach building audiences, new communities, and the like. And so I think what's really troubling has been that local capacity and the corporate consolidation that has led to a significant decrease in options for journalists, as well as a decrease in option for folks who consume news and information. And what's, I think, most troubling about it has been as these newsrooms have shrunk over time, the companies that used to employ journalists, for instance, back in the day, the San Jose Mercury News had 400 people in its newsroom. When I led the Oakland Tribune, obviously numbers had gone down considerably, but I had schools reporter, city hall reporter, we had business reporters. I mean, there was, considering the capacity, there was considerably more to cover the news and information needs. Now there isn't even a dedicated schools reporter in Oakland. So it's, what's really troubling about it has been corporate media, which I have real concerns now about its viability and also the role that journalism plays in our communities. It is an essential service. And so this notion that profit-driven journalism is healthy for a community, I have real concerns and about that now, and I think that's bearing out as we're navigating this whole COVID crisis. So just to wrap up, what's really been frustrating to see is an erosion of capacity, of options in service of profitability and a lack of innovation.
Right. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I had the same experience. I come from the broadcast side. And when I was at KCBS, we had bureaus all over the Bay Area. We had a city hall reporter. We had a Hall of Justice reporter, and that is no more. Everyone's general assignment. There are fewer bodies to do the work. And it's not as if, certainly ad revenue has been a challenge and there have been some financial challenges, but it's not as if that was a death knell. there are a lot of news outlets that are profitable, that are seeing strong readership, that want where readers and viewers and listeners want information. But instead of taking whatever was made off of subscribers, et cetera, hedge funds and corporate-owned media are siphoning that to shareholders. And so basically pulling what used to be a nice cycle of revenue to content building out. And Michael, you made an interesting point when we chatted yesterday about the idea of how publicly traded companies work and the algorithmic triggers that happen when it appears that there's a financial downturn. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that sort of publicly traded financial picture and how it's impacting our local journalism.
Yeah, I want to echo what Martin said about the market failure in journalism. The business worked pretty well since the beginning of the 20th century. Newspapers were basically printing money for decades because they had a monopoly on local advertising. Basically, the local department store and a lot of local businesses, if they wanted to get their eyeballs in front of the public, they had to use the newspaper as an intermediary, and newspapers were the kind of bottom of the food chain for local accountability journalism. That was disrupted in the early 2000s. And when there started to be signs of distress in terms of the revenue models, that's when a lot of large companies started coming in and saying, okay, these are distressed properties. Let's see if we can liquidate some of these assets and turn a quick profit. So you see hedge funds like the one that owns the Media News Group, or whatever it's calling itself this month, that owns the Mercury News, what used to be the Contra Costa Times, which is now the East Bay Times, which used to own the Oakland Tribune before they all but eviscerated it. And you see that trend all across the country. What it has created is a environment where any kind of minor shock or significant shock really can destabilize the whole thing. And so you have seen just in the last 6 weeks or so, scores of local publications furloughing, laying off many of their staff, even people who had been working there for decades. And locally, you have seen that too. The trouble you run into is when you have publicly traded companies in particular, and they're looking for their next quarterly earnings statement to put out to the public. If there is a shock that is anticipated to be more than 3 months in duration, like say a global pandemic, there is enormous pressure to make those quarterly earnings statements look as good as possible. And so you have seen a really instantaneous wave of cutbacks. And this is precisely the wrong time to be doing that.
Absolutely. In fact, readership is up at local news outlets across the country because all of us, one, we're captive at home, many of us, if we're not an essential employee and out working. But two, we want to know what's going on, and information comes out day by day, sometimes moment to moment. We want information, we want to understand, and we rely on our local news outlets to help us with that. And at that same moment, we've got this corporate model at a lot of mainstream outlets, which is leading to cutbacks. So we also have the other models of journalism. We have, community journalism, nonprofit journalism, subscriber bases, and these are all these are all really powerful and important models that we should discuss. And how are they faring in this moment, in this pandemic, at this time, and how can we help grow some of those models to help balance out the corporate media model, which is very prevalent. Martin, would you like to speak on this?
So, what's interesting is, really before this pandemic occurred, I think some of the most exciting developments, innovations, opportunities had really begun to bubble up from the nonprofit independent space. Organizations like INN, Independent News Network, and Lion Publishers uh, are seeing increased membership. And there was so many, and particularly as it relates to the nonprofit space, so many places popping up where there are gaps left by the closure of thousands of legacy news organizations over the last number of years. So that's sort of been the positive side. And then philanthropy had begun to step in and support many of these, some of them for nonprofit, and then there are other programs focusing on trying to help these organizations thrive. There's a program that the Institute is involved in called Table Stakes. It's been funded by the Knight Foundation for about 5 years. It's focused on major metro news organizations, but also there's cohorts focused in North Carolina right now, for instance, focusing on in nonprofit space. There's other programs like the Media Transformation Challenge that's underway, where there are independent outlets like, and nonprofit outlets like Cal Matters that are a part of that, working for them to focus on their business models and audience growth and the like. So that was the good news. The bad news is that now so many of these opportunities for revenue, and many of them are being hit significantly. There's an effort underway to try and address, particularly in the ethnic media space and independent media space, where these organizations are already underfunded. Some of them are for-profit. Many of them are now facing huge, massive financial challenges. And so there's calls going on nationally and even in California for there to be what's called like a Marshall Plan for journalism, where philanthropy and government spending would step in. Government spending as it relates to, for instance, ad revenue. There's the census, for instance, has been spending more than $100 million across the state to support, or $100 million, I guess it's been across the state, that has been paid to these outlets for advertising to support folks taking the census. So there's thoughts underway that the government should somehow step in to support these independent, particularly independent nonprofit, but also even for-profit outfits. So I have some issues with that, and we could talk about that later. And I think what needs to also happen is philanthropy needs to step in. The question is, can these independent outlets, which had been really a light and beacon, like the public press, been a light and a beacon, have their support maintained when audiences are worried about their own ability to make ends meet, and the need is so great for philanthropy to be able to step in and fill this gap, and it remains to be seen.
Absolutely. And I know the Maynard Institute is doing some incredible work with newsrooms of color and trying to support nonprofit journalism. And Martin brought up the San Francisco Public Press. We are on a webinar sponsored by the San Francisco Public Press, which is doing incredible explanatory journalism and trying to stay on top of this and many other important stories. So talk a little bit about the San Francisco Public Press's financial model and how you're navigating this moment.
Well, we started up in 2009, not really knowing what our financial model was, but knowing that we had to take a different tack from what we saw as the worrying trend of the closure of a lot, the beginning of the closure of a lot of publications, the closure of investigative units at major publications like the San Francisco Chronicle, downsizing of other publications, consolidation of almost all the newspapers in cities outside of San Francisco in the Bay Area. And we knew that it was important from the very beginning to build a broad base of public support. And so we were one of the first organizations as members of the Investigative News Network, which then became the Institute for Nonprofit News, INN.org, which is a cohort of now about 120 organizations around the country. We were one of those organizations that was earliest in saying, okay, we need to, in some sense, replicate the stability and the countercyclical success, countercyclical with the economy, success of public broadcasting in getting pledges from the public to continue the work, to do sort of direct to consumer journalism rather than having advertising, which is, economically kind of a roller coaster. And you see every time there's a recession, there are waves of cutbacks. What kind of alternative models are there to even out those ups and downs? Uh, we have supplemented that greatly with the addition of community foundations and some national journalism foundations. Um, it is, but philanthropy still is, even after the shrinkage of a lot of the advertising market, is still relatively small source of funding overall. And so a lot of what nonprofit journalism has been doing, and INN in particular, is making the case to community foundations and other philanthropists to say, you know, you typically fund direct service to your community. Well, let's explain. We need to explain to you why we think that journalism is a direct service. And and talking about the cutbacks, I mean, why it matters. A couple of things that we've seen on the ground. Um, San Francisco is not exactly a news desert, um, but there are many areas across the country that have no daily source of news. Oakland, kind of incredibly has become one of those, but there are efforts now afoot to fill that gap. Pretty impressive efforts. Um, but all across the state, we have seen over the last 10 years, um, a, a a loss of the ability or willingness of, for example, public information officers at public agencies to be forthcoming with public records under the California Public Records Act and the San Francisco Sunshine Ordinance and other sunshine ordinances in other cities. And you talk to these agencies and they say, why do you want this information? Which is in the California Public Records Act. It says, do not ask anybody who asks for public records why you want the information. That's illegal. And we get asked that question all the time. And often it's a game of delay and deny and fight and filing all of these affidavits as to why records are not public, because public information officers are out of practice working with journalists because there are so few investigative reporters left on the beat. It is the reflex is gone. So that I think to me, as much as anything, demonstrates the need to fill in these gaps, not just in the daily bread and butter um, uh, reporting, but also the deep dive explanatory and investigative reporting that goes beyond the headlines, reads between the lines, and sometimes questions the conventional wisdom about how things work, and really stays on um, people in power, and documents the effects on the average person.
Yeah, excellent points all around. It's true that when you don't have a strong journalism outlet or more than one in a community, that you get less accountability. I mean, this has been proven in study after study. And so, as Rick Juergens, one of our listeners today, points out, we need a new financial model to focus on news as a social good, which I know the San Francisco Public Press is doing, and the INN, which has now got more than 200 members. Go ahead, Michael.
Can I just add one thing? I don't want to be doctrinaire about the nonprofit model, because
Sure.
there are many more startups in this space, represented by an even larger kind of umbrella group called Lion Publishers. I love the acronym, Local Independent Online News Publishers.
Awesome.
And that's nonprofits and for-profits together. But there is this flowering of new publications, new approaches, new business models, and I think what is promising is not not the growth of the nonprofit sector in particular, but or the nonprofit business model and ownership model, but the diversity of different approaches, and that is what creates sustainability and resilience in journalism, is to have a lot of different models, so that if one sector experiences a trauma, you don't have the whole thing collapsing because it's not a monoculture. What we have now, or what we had, up until the last couple of years, was an increasing trend toward a monoculture of for-profit or even hedge fund owned, advertising based, slashed newsrooms. And that was just a recipe for disaster. And what our organization, but a lot of others like it, are trying to do is build up alternatives and experiment in a lot of different directions, so that we're more resilient in the next crisis.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think, keeping the mission in mind is important, no matter what the model is that you choose. Social good, informing the public, holding power to account. Martin, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your views on media models, financial models for local journalism. Because, of course, I know you think a diversity is a good idea, but I'm wondering if all are equal in your eyes.
Well, if I had the answer to what the financial model would be, I'd be like, in the Bahamas right now,
Yeah.
socially distancing from my yacht. But but I think, what we teach at the Maynard Institute, we're the oldest journalism nonprofit, training journalism nonprofit dedicating to help America's newsrooms reflect the diversity of the nation. And we train journalists. We also support journalism entrepreneurs, which we think is another really important direction to go, particularly journalism entrepreneurs of diverse backgrounds. And so what we believe is that you have to think, journalism organizations need to think of themselves in many ways as organizing institutions as well. There's a lack of trust that's going on right now in media. There's a desire for trustworthy news and information. And what we have been teaching with partnerships from our friends, for instance, at the Free Press, and holding some convenings with community organizers and journalists so that we could teach, so that they could learn from community organizers about how to build trust and therefore grow audience. So in a lot of the work that we're doing, as news organizations are pivoting from advertising-based models to subscriber-based models, what's really compelling is how they continue to want to super serve their existing audiences. They're sort of white knuckle holding tight to the audiences that they've had, when in many instances they're in communities that are incredibly diverse and could have audiences that could grow. The problem is that in many instances they've been hollowed out, or have not had and don't have diverse staff to begin with. There's a lack of diversity that exists. So how are you going to go reach an audience that you haven't ever reached, haven't ever served, or have portrayed disproportionately in stories about crime or violence or other things, or just haven't covered at all, and then ask them to support you? How is that going to happen? And so we believe that, there's all this effort underway to have community engagement editors. I was one of the first community engagement editors for Bay Area News Group. I had no staff and no budget. It was a great job. Actually, it was a great job. But so what we actually think news organizations need to have are organizing editors whose job it is to galvanize community around news and information and make the case for why people in community should support it. I think we have to, now there's a crisis afoot now where things could close, right? So there needs to be some infusion of capital, and that's where philanthropy and perhaps this effort to think about having government spend marketing dollars so that there's some distance to help keep things afloat, right? So there's the crisis mode. But the problem is that news organizations have not thought ahead. And so what can come out of this needs to be an emphasis of communities need to support news and information. And journalists and news writ large have done a terrible job over the last 50 years of making the case for why that is, and we've focused on advertisers to underwrite the cost of news gathering. And now you could argue that news organizations are the most ill-equipped than they probably have ever been to actually make the case in communities that they haven't served why they should be supported. The good news is that I think if that they can begin to rethink this approach and start moving incrementally in this direction. I don't know that it's going to solve the problem tomorrow, but long term, it has to be people who believe in the outlets that serve them, and society has to support journalism. It can't be advertising, and it can't just be philanthropy.
Absolutely. And I think many newsrooms have been working at efficiency level for so long, for a lot of reasons based on financial models and cutbacks, et cetera. But you're right. There's also a mentality or a mindset inside many newsrooms of kind of holding fast to how it's been and what seems to be working. And that idea, I love what you just said about an organizing editor, someone to, for me, I would say build relationships, because it's so important to build relationships with your community. We know how to do this, journalists, with sources, right? You build a relationship with a source, you get a story, you maybe get an inside tip, et cetera. But building relationships with your audience that's consuming your content, that you're informing, that you're trying to, to let people know about information.
And one point I just want to make on that
Yeah.
is that there needs to also, the argument about why diversity matters has been something that we've been trying to make for many years. The moral obligation, there's a trust quotient. But the other thing is that people need to tie diversity to their most sustainable and economic future. How does reaching diverse audiences tether to revenue and sustainability? And if you approach it from that perspective, then you can begin to strategize around, okay, well, what would a plan look like to engender support and to build audience and therefore revenue?
Absolutely true. Go ahead, Michael.
There is a virtuous cycle when you're, somewhat starting afresh, when your infrastructure is so hollowed out that you have little to lose. A lot of the startups have really started from the mission and worked outward, and a lot of the journalists who have started these news organizations and communities across the country, laid off or otherwise downsized from commercial publications in their areas, have looked inside and looked out to the community and said, okay, what was missing in the first place from these traditional legacy news organizations? What stories are undercovered, and how can we get the most qualified people to tell those stories, people from those communities? And there is much more of an emphasis on social issues reporting, as opposed to lifestyle and other, what I would call non-core journalistic responsibilities. And so I think that's what gives me hope more than anything, is that there really does seem to be a reinvigoration in the journalism community and among people who are starting up new ideas, that journalism has a social mission. There is a social responsibility that we need to fulfill, and there needs to be open lines of communication with the community of supporters to make that happen.
Absolutely. I think mission has to be always front facing, and we are in a crisis now. And so we're responding in crisis mode, but this is absolutely the time to talk about how to do this right or how to do this well. And I want to piggyback on a question asked by Erica Lawson. The AP just hired Aaron Morrison as the race and ethnicity reporter. Do you think we'll see more local news outlets going this route because it's, quote, good for business and their integrity? And I actually want to tie that question into historical examples of this. In the 60s, during the civil rights movement, many mainstream news outlets hired away some of the best journalists from Black newspapers and Latinx newspapers. And then once those journalists got to the mainstream outlets, they weren't covering stories that maybe those audiences are interested in hearing. They were then put on mainstream beats. So I think this is absolutely an important conversation to have so that we do this right. And Martin, I'm wondering if you have any insights into that.
Well, I mean, what I'm heartened by and is, and I sort of ended up thinking about this after our conversation the other day, and it also was reflective on somebody in the chat asking about sort of these local experiments that are underway.
Yeah, Bruce Kuhn, thank you so much.
Yeah, and so the thing that's really exciting is that there is something obviously underway where there's an effort to build this Oakland newsroom that's being put forth by the folks from Berkeley side, and it's and there's they've been undertaking a really tremendous process for how to have you stand shoulder to shoulder with the community in shaping your editorial vision. I think this goes to this notion of sort of community connection, public good, and listening, talking, asking, finding out what are the issues that are needed, what needs to be covered, and then approaching it that way, and then being vocal and transparent about how you are doing your journalism. And so I'm really excited about that. They were able to get a few $1 million from Google. I still at times have concern about who gets money. So I'm on the board, and to be frank, I'm on the board of this effort. And so I'm excited that they were able to get, more than $3 million from a number of funders to support this. But I'm also cognizant of who gets the money, right? The Berkeley side folks, who the founders, they're white, they're thoughtful and very good, intentional people. But I don't know the last time that a entrepreneur of color got that amount of money to start a venture like that, even though it's an incredibly worthwhile venture and they're being incredibly thoughtful and intentional and collaborative and inclusive in their effort. So I give them mad props for that. So also another initiative that's underway that is Oakland Voices that we've been doing. I started it when I was at the Oakland Tribune, where we train residents to be storytellers. They've been doing great work covering COVID-19 across the city. So, but it's a very underfunded outfit, and it's community members telling stories. It's great, but it's not the same as, experienced journalists who know how to file public records, who know how to dig into deep dive stories. They play a role, but it's not a replacement. So I'm heartened by that. I think Oakland is going to end up getting a really great outlet as a result of this to compete against the hollowed out iteration of the Tribune, which I'm excited about because we still like to be competitive. But much more needs to be done to support. And I also think that there needs to be more collaborations between mainstream publications and ethnic media and independent media. There's can be some real opportunities there to benefit each one.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And it's true. Entities such as Google, Facebook, Twitter are players in the game, and they have the financial support, ability to support local journalists. But it is important to make sure that biases are called out and that everyone has a seat at the table so that we do this inclusively and we do this holistically. We're nearing the end of our time. Michael and Martin, anything you'd like to add before we wrap it up today?
Michael, I ran my mouth. Go ahead.
This is a really hard time for everybody. It is also a time of great excitement in our field, that this is kind of our moment to give back and to really give it our all, as what Mayor Breed has called news organizations essential services. We need more public information, independent public information about how this crisis is being handled, because official sources are not entirely reliable in terms of reporting on themselves, as we have seen from the local to the national level. And so the idea of trustworthy, independent viewpoints and research into what's really going on and how we can get ourselves out of this public health crisis is so important. And thankfully, there have been there's just been a cavalcade of philanthropists that have seen the urgent need, not just to fund testing outlets and soup kitchens, and and rental support for people who are in dire straits, but also enterprise journalism about about public health that hopefully will translate into much bigger commitments going forward. There's my dream is that all of the organizations that are interested in public health will give 5% of their revenue, or of their philanthropic giving to independent journalists to cover the sector, to make the whole system much more efficient and accountable.
Great, thanks. And if you're not a philanthropist, if you're an average everyday person, like maybe many of us on the webinar today or listening later, how can we help? How can audiences contribute, support? What can they do in this effort?
Well, this is not an infomercial for the public press, but you can become a member at starting at $35 a year. Go to our website, sfpublicpress.org. INN, the Institute for Nonprofit News, has a whole page of organizations around the country that are doing similar things. Some of them are 30 plus years old. Some of them are a year old. There's the Oakland project started by Berkeley side that's up and coming. There's a new one that's a year old in San Jose called San Jose Spotlight. A lot of these gaps are being filled out. You can go to the INN page if there's good work that you see in one of the 120 plus organizations there. You might want to donate to one or more of them. But you can also get involved by communicating directly, not just with startup news organizations, but legacy organizations, and telling them what kind of news you want to see, rather than just being satisfied with one-way communication. This is the 21st century. We all have to really be accountable to the audience. The audience is much more of co-creators of news than they were before.
Absolutely. Martin, anything you want to add as a final?
No, I agree with all that, and I just think that supporting, pushing back, also being mindful that to think about what ethnic and non-traditional journalism outfits you can support. There are many out there, and they are absolutely in need of support. And I would also just say that this moment in time is an opportunity to rethink our approach to journalism. It certainly has given me a great pause as seeing how this pandemic has disproportionately impacted different communities of diverse backgrounds and communities of color. I think as journalists, the way in which part of the reason we have not been supported is because of the way we have framed many of these issues. And there's this notion of objectivity that approaches issues like health disparities or economic disparities from the sense of that there needs to be balanced, when in fact the issue is already imbalanced. So our approach to coverage feels inauthentic, or it feels as though it isn't really connecting in a way. There's this sort of efforts to address false equivalency and to sort of come at issues as though as though balance already exists when it doesn't in our society. And so I think as we look ahead, we have to also think about how have we covered these issues, and how has that led to communities completely turning away from us, and understanding that it's going to take time. It's going to be incremental. You don't show up with a bouquet of flowers to a community that you haven't served and expect them to want to take it. It's not going to be like that. It's going to take time. It's going to be incremental. But in the long term, it's going to be essential.
Absolutely.
Can I just jump on that really quick? Part of the mission driving good journalism is being a check on abuse of power, and I think to Martin's point, systems of inequality that are being shown, that are being revealed rapidly in this crisis. always were a systemic abuse of power. And so to the extent that news organizations and journalists can examine and critique the existing background inequality that was always there, um, and 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 focus on ways to ameliorate and remedy the background inequality um, in society, I think that is, above anything. That's my goal as a journalist, is to fight for a fair society, using the tools of objective journalism that we have at our disposal.
Thank you so much. Thank you to you both. That was Martin Reynolds, co-executive director of the Maynard Institute and director of the Reveal Investigative Fellowships from the Center for Investigative Reporting, and Michael Stoll, executive director of the San Francisco Public Press. We were talking about the future of local media and media challenges facing community journalism before, during, and after the pandemic. I'm Gina Baleria, and you've been listening to Civic.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Gina, Martin, Michael, thank you so much. Daphne and Laura, thanks for helping out behind the scenes. Everyone who joined us today, we're glad that it looks almost everybody stuck out for the whole event. Thank you for joining the San Francisco Public Press for this Public Press Live event. Make sure you're signed up for our newsletter so you hear about future events. We hope to see you next time. Have a great day.
Bye.